Nvidia's CEO was just asked some questions about DLSS5 and the controversy on episode 494 of the Lex Friedman podcast. And while the vast majority of this 2.5 hours is not about gaming or DLSS, if you jump into chapter 17 at about the 1 hour 49 minute mark, you get to this section. I've pulled the transcript here, and we'll link the full video in the video description. And pulling the transcript, we can get into some of these interesting comments. Now, I want to be clear that we are looking at the CEO of Nvidia, who is by definition not going to be an unbiased source of information on the use of generative AI, etc., and Nvidia technologies. But what's interesting here is I think that we get some of his vision of where he sees this technology developing to become, but not actually a good description of what it currently is. And I think that's going to be a very important distinction as we jump into analyzing what he's saying. I also am going to try to tie this into a broader conversation that I don't have all the answers to, which is regarding the use of generative AI in video games, because this is becoming extremely controversial. We just saw, for example, Crimson Desert launch and get a bunch of pushback and seeing a bunch of apologies now about the inclusion of AI-generated art in the game, and they're saying that it was never intended to be there besides a placeholder. Now, we then had ex-Blizzard boss chime in saying that the devs should just man up and every single video game in the future is going to have generative AI use. And his take is like developers should stop apologizing for this and just include it because and just own that's just going to be a part of game development and every game is going to use it. That's his take. Then we have some other developers like Capcom who are trying to set policies where they're talking to, investors, boards, et cetera, and outlining their policies regarding generative AI use. Capcom is really interesting because they are one of the companies who has signed off to use DLSS5, and yet they're saying that they will not implement any generative AI assets into their video games. They will use it to improve efficiency and productivity in game development. But this is a really interesting take because DLSS5 is generative AI that does face the end user when they are playing the game. And nobody at NVIDIA, including their CEO, is denying that DLSS5 is generative AI. And yet you have a company here saying that they won't implement generative AI assets into their games, but they are implementing a technology that then shows the end user an image that is at least enhanced through generative AI, even if it is informed by artist-created assets. So really what we're seeing right now is the we're seeing a huge discussion that is far beyond my pay grade to have all the answers to regarding what is going to be the role of generative AI in video game development. It is obviously going to be used in the development process. Currently, we're seeing a lot of pushback against actually AI-generated art assets being in the final shipped game, and most developers seem to at least publicly be stating that that is also their stance, that even if they use it in the development process, that it shouldn't be AI art shouldn't be in the final shipping game. And yet, then you have DLSS5 walk into this, basically by design, making everything that you see in the game, in some sense, generative AI art. And then you have some people basically saying, just man up, it's all going to be generative AI, guys. Now, I am sure I'm going to get a whole bunch of people's opinions in the comment section, and I welcome that. I think where we're going to start now is what actually are the direct quotes we have from Jensen Huang about DLSS5 and the controversy that it has stirred up. Although before we get into that, there was just a really interesting comment right before this where Jensen Huang tells us how he views the gaming division of NVIDIA. he views it as their number one marketing strategy. That's pretty interesting. So I think we should at least mention that, even if it's not the main topic of today's video, because a lot of gamers are kind of wondering, does Nvidia care at all about gaming right now? And how does the Nvidia CEO even view gaming in the grand scheme of their AI data center business, which again is the main topic of this 2.5-hour podcast. So what we're seeing here is when Lex Fridman transitions into the topic for gaming, he says he's a big gaming fan, have to thank you for NVIDIA for many years of incredible graphics, and Jensen Huang just jumps in right there. By the way, GeForce is still, to this day, our number one marketing strategy. And that's interesting, that when transitioning to the video game topic, his instant response before being even asked a question is just to say how he views the GeForce gaming brand at NVIDIA. He views it as their number one marketing strategy. And I just find that to be fascinating that is instantly where he went to. And he says people learn about NVIDIA while they're in their teenage years, and then they go to college and they know who NVIDIA is. And then in beginning is just, playing Call of Duty or Fortnite. And then later they're using CUDA, and then later they're using NVIDIA and Blender, Autodesk. Anyway, some of these I'm going to slightly paraphrase because this is a spoken word interview and it's a direct transcript of that. I pulled that from YouTube's automatic transcript feature here on the side. So some of these I'll try to clean up slightly for sounding a bit smoother since it is spoken off the cuff remarks. But the full text transcript is on the screen here. Anyway, so I thought that was just really interesting. That was his just jumping in without even being asked a question. He views GeForce as NVIDIA's number one marketing strategy. Anyway, now he gets asked the question about the DLSS5 controversy. So Lex Fridman asks, there was some controversy around this with DLSS5. Can you explain to me the drama around this? I guess people, the gamers online, were concerned that it makes games look like AI slop. What do you think of this drama? And Jensen Huang says, I think their perspective makes sense, and I could see where they're coming from, because I don't love AI slop myself. All of the AI-generated content increasingly looks similar, and they're all beautiful. And I'm empathetic towards what they're thinking. But that's just not what DLSS5 is trying to do. And then he goes on to explain more about the technology. So before we move further, I think maybe we unpack this a little bit. So first thing I'll say is that this at least feels like a much more tactful response to this controversy than the initial one we had a week ago, where he's at least being more outwardly acknowledging the concern that it makes characters look like AI slop. In other words, regardless of people's take on whether the final image looks better or worse, a lot of people don't like the look of if the AI, generative AI, is trained on pictures of, studio lit pictures of beautiful people wearing makeup, then it might make all of the images look more like that, like they're studio lit, more conventionally attractive people than the actual underlying character model. And that might not always fit the artistic intent of the game or the scene or the character. So he is at least acknowledging that is a concern, but then switches into saying that that's not what DLSS5 is trying to do. So now we get back into trying to explain what it does, but then also I think what we really get is a description of what he wants DLSS5 to be, but in a future version, which I don't think is describing what it currently is. And I'll give more thoughts on that once we read his take. So he says that that's just not what DLSS5 is trying to do. He says I showed several examples of it, but DLSS5 is 3D conditioned, 3D guided. It's ground truth structure data guided. And so the artists determined the geometry. We are completely truthful to the geometry. It maintains in every single frame. it's conditioned by the textures, the artistry of the artists. And so every single frame, it enhances, but it doesn't change anything. And then he gets into, so that's his description of what's happening now. And we could discuss whether we feel that that's completely fair or accurate. And then, like I said, what he gets into next is, to me, a description of what he wants it to be, but not what it currently is. Anyway, let's unpack this piece. So what broke in my earlier video, where I asked questions that made it completely clear that DLSS5 does not actually have access to any of the 3D geometry data, then you start to question things like, this character's hairline seems to be a sharp cut here, and yet the DLSS5 generative AI seems to have interpreted it as a softer fade. You see things like this shadow on the nostril here seeming to be misinterpreted in its underlying geometry, which does not include a very wide nostril there. The generative AI seems to have viewed part of that shadow as actually part of the nose. And so you get either what could be viewed as a wider nostril, or I've seen some people look at it where if you just look at this piece right here, it almost looks like you're looking at a full nose, but from a different perspective. I realize that's cut off the screen here, sorry. With my OBS window, there, now you can see what I'm saying. That almost looks like a full nose, but from a different perspective than the face. That's then attached to the other side of a nose from a different perspective. In other words, it's possible that the generative AI is misreading the underlying geometry. So even if it is designed to try to be respectful of the underlying geometry, and when you read statements like this, it makes it sound like the 3D geometry is an input without directly saying it. It is the case that the 3D geometry is not an input into the DLSS5 model, only the 2D image. So it's just the color in a 2D image and two-dimensional motion vectors for where things are moving to between one frame to the next. So with that in mind, it is truthful that the model is taking in an input that was informed by geometry, but it is not taking the geometry itself as an input. And then it is absolutely running it through a generative AI that is going to be heavily influenced by its training data. Now, I would like more information on what that training data is, and I did ask Nvidia for additional comment on that among some other questions that I referenced in my last video, but I still have not received a reply to that. So in other words, none of this answers the question of, okay, but if the training data is more conventionally attractive people in studio-lit professional photos and wearing makeup, then that can influence the output image that we're getting in a way that the artist may not have intended, and the model could misinterpret the underlying geometry because it's just guessing based off of a two-dimensional render, not off of the actual 3D geometry data. So that's where I think you have to be very careful how you read his statement there. Now, he is also saying that the question about enhancing DLSS5 also lets you, because it's an open system, you could, now notice he's saying could. So he's now, I think, talking about how he wants this to work in the future. But again, I don't think he's describing what it is currently doing, at least when it's been explained to us in any detail we've been given access to. So he's saying you could train your own models to determine, and you could even in the future, so again, now he's being really explicit, in the future prompt it. So I think what we're looking at is his vision of what like DLSS 6 might be, or 7, where you could prompt the AI to give a different look. And that was one of the questions that I had asked in my first email exchange with some NVIDIA representatives regarding this. Was really it was about the about her. Like if the artist didn't want this output where it looks like she's wearing additional makeup because it didn't match the fact that she's going to the scene of her mother's murder and wouldn't be dressed up like that for that event, can the artist ask it to not have the character wearing makeup at that time. And then also bigger things about just the style of the game. Is it all overly influenced by the training data that has a specific look? And I didn't really get any response that seemed to indicate that developers, artists actually have that level of control. So Nvidia CEO here is talking about a future version of this technology, as I understand it here, where he's saying that you could prompt it. You could train your own models. You could prompt it. He's saying, I want it. He's saying, you could say, I want it to be a toon shader, or I want it to look like this kind of, so you can give it even an example and it would generate in the style of that. All consistent with the artistry, the style, the intent of the artist. And so all of that is done for the artist so that they can create something that is more beautiful, but still in the style that they want. And so, like I said here, it seems like what he's describing isn't how the technology currently works. The artistic controls that we've been told about include the kinds of things that you would see when you're in a photo editing, a basic photo editor, where you could increase the brightness or the color grading. So things like gamma and color grading, or you could mask off areas that you don't want, and you can change the intensity of the effect. But when I was asking could you ask it to not wear makeup, we didn't get an answer yes to that. Just referred back to these other things. So he's describing a future which doesn't seem to be the current version of the technology, but seems to be where he wants it to go, where you could prompt it with more detail about the style that you want. And I think that at least would be better than what is currently described. But like I said, all of this looming in the background is this discussion about the role of generative AI in video games. And is that something that we want in the end product at all? In other words, let's take a little bit of a sidestep here about the whole DLSS5 situation, because there are many takes on it, and some of them are negative but for different reasons, and some of them are positive but for different reasons. And so I think it's important here to break down some of those differences. So one of the reactions to DLSS5 is just a negative reaction to the output image, feeling like it just looks worse because it gives us that AI slop feeling that we get scrolling through social media, which is taken as a negative, and so people view that as bad. So if people are in the camp where they just don't like the look of the output image, I think those are people who could be swayed by a system that improved to allow additional control over the final look, and then maybe it doesn't have that look to it. And then I think you can have some people who would then be on board with the technology because their issues with the technology isn't that it is generative AI. Their issues with it is that it doesn't look good to their eye, right? So I think that if this technology improves, you can have some people react more positively to it if they just start liking the output image better, and if the artists have increased control over what the AI is generating. But I think you have another camp of people whose negative reaction to this is more about the just not wanting generative AI, period, as something that you're going to outwardly see when playing the game. And there are some people with an even stricter stance where they don't want to see generative AI used at all in the development process, even if none of the art ends up being end user facing. And those people, I don't think, are going to be swayed by a further development of the technology along the lines that Nvidia CEO is describing here. Anyway, so he's back to the Nvidia CEO quote here. We're seeing, I think that they got the impression, referring to gamers again, that the games are going to come out the way the games are shipped the way they do, meaning like the way games are already developed, and then we're going to post-process it. That's not what DLSS is intended to do. DLSS is integrated with the artist, and so it's about giving the artist the tool of generative AI. And they could not use it, you know. Okay, so this last statement is another, I think, really big deal as far as how he views the future of this developing, where he's basically saying, okay, so what you're seeing right now is games that were already developed without this technology. So he understands that people are seeing it as a post-process filter applied to a game that already existed. But he's saying that he views it as a technology that is going to be part of the development process that artists are using the entire time that they're making the game. And so as they develop the game and they see it through the lens of how DLSS is interpreting what they're creating, that they could then, change what they're creating and then prompt in future versions the AI until the output is what they want to see. Now, again, I think that there are people in the camp where they just want the output image to be pleasing and look better, and then they could be swayed by something like this. I think you have other people in a camp of they don't want generative AI in the game, period, and that this description of game development turning into this is their absolute nightmare. And so there's absolutely going to be that camp of people. And then I think that this also brings up an additional concern that's kind of riding in the background of all of this, which is vendor lock. So if it becomes the case that this is the way that game artists are designing their game, and it's all with the lens of people will view it through the DLSS output, and game developers are changing the way that they develop a game so that the DLSS output version, in other words, the game developer controls the image on the left and then sees the image on the right during the game development process. So they then maybe they're like, oh no, I didn't want that to be a fade. I wanted that to be a sharp cut. Or oh no, it misinterpreted the nose here. So now do they go back and change the nose and change the haircut so that the output through DLSS ends up being more like what they like? And this is what I think Nvidia is describing as how they see this playing out. The game developers are altering the geometry and textures during the game development process and viewing it through the DLSS5 output to then have control over the DLSS5 output, and that in future versions, perhaps you could even prompt it for different styles. Now, while again, that is going to be a model where you could see how they're viewing that as more control, I think that that model is the absolute nightmare for people who are worried about vendor lock in the NVIDIA ecosystem. Now, obviously, from NVIDIA's perspective, that's that's a benefit, right? They want the vendor lock on the technology. But imagine this. So if you're not playing a game on a DLSS-capable graphics card, whether it's an older NVIDIA card that can't run these models, or whether you're on a competitor like AMD or Intel, or whatever comes out in the future. I mean, we're seeing Chinese GPUs, it's trying to be developed. Whatever that future is, if the underlying game geometry and textures are starting to be designed so that they are taking in mind how DLSS5 will interpret them, and you're one of the end users who doesn't want to be on the NVIDIA side of things, or you aren't on the NVIDIA side of things, is your version of the game getting worse because it's not how the developers think you're going to be seeing it? And that plays into huge problems with vendor lock. And so I see that as a bit of a nightmare future from the perspective of what that looks like for the end user and vendor locking technologies. So I'll come down with a hard personal stance on this. I don't want that to be how game developers are working. Now, I did try to ask, I did ask and did get a response, but it was a non-answer, whether NVIDIA has looked into the development of DirectX to now include cooperative vectors so that you can program things through DirectX to run on the machine learning hardware on various GPU brands and vendors. And so I asked about that. if Nvidia saw a future where their previously proprietary technologies like DLSS could actually run through DirectML and be open to all platforms. Now, one of the main reasons why I was asking about that is regarding this concern on vendor lock. So it has absolutely been stated by AMD and Sony and Microsoft that the next generation of consoles is going to have a neural rendering. Neural rendering is going to be part of it. Now, it's unclear if this is what they mean by neural rendering, but if we are moving to a future where the game developer is viewing output that is enhanced in some way or altered in some way, however you want to view it, by a generative AI, but each brand, the consoles, the different GPU makers have their own proprietary version of what that AI enhancement looks like. Imagine that situation as an artist working on the game, right? That doesn't sound good to me. So I'm trying to think big picture about, if game development does go down this pathway, man, the artists are really probably not going to be wanting to see a million different versions of how an AI is going to be interpreting this as their main workflow. But that's the workflow that's being described here, except instead of in a million different versions, it's only the DLSS version, right? So we're heading into a weird future where we're going to see a bunch of different attempts at neural rendering and how to bring that in and how much this gets vendor locked down into proprietary parts. And oh man, I don't know. Guys, I'm not a game developer. I am interested if any of you are in how you see things like this. Because there's other things that have been called neural rendering that are just very much not this. So there's, game graphics programmers who have talked about exploring neural rendering. And what they're looking at is something very, very different. What they're looking at is things like, within the game engine, things that you would normally do in the game engine, so normal graphics rendering functions, could you train a machine learning model to take in similar inputs to what the game normally gives to the normal way of rendering it, but then trains it to do machine learning inference for the outputs? And could you speed up the process and or increase the quality of the outputs? And this is a process that would be happening directly within the game engine, and it's still part of the rendering process. It's not processing the final rendered image in post, which, again, as much as the Nvidia CEO doesn't want to admit it, post-processing, it is taking output frames and post-processing them. It is processing them post the actual render of the game frame, right? That is post-processing, like as clear-cut definition as it is. But again, I think he's seeing the view of future game development being done with the DLSS5 image as part of your workflow. And wow, yeah, that's where I have a lot of questions about this. And then, like I said, what is the role of generative AI in video games? Is the ex-Blizzard boss saying the quiet part out loud that from the perspective of the big studios and leadership and money people in charge, yeah, generative AI is absolutely going to be in every single video game? Or are companies really going to actually stick to not having generative AI assets show up at least to the end user? In which case, how is that compatible with DLSS5? Right? And if we get similar technologies from competitors, or and what about other stuff in between? So where is all of this going to land? We are moving into I think some kind of an inflection point in how games are developed and how they're presented to us. And we're going to start seeing different and potentially conflicting versions of what that could be. And I think right here, we are getting the picture into how Nvidia's CEO wants it to be. They want the game developers to be looking at the DLSS5 output image as their view of how people will interact with the game, and they'll just be changing the underlying assets to better control that. And eventually they'll be able to prompt it in additional ways. And yeah, I think some people are going to be swayed by, as long as the output image looks better, cool. And other people are going to come down harder on the just anti-generative AI stance, regardless of the actual quality of the output of the generative AI. And like I said, that all of it brings up huge questions about vendor lock. And I'm not sure there's anything else particularly interesting here, because when asked a little bit more about it, he kind of goes off about talking about how just introducing new tools, like how they brought up subsurface scattering and things like that. I'm just like, that's really a completely different thing, because subsurface scattering is the kind of thing that's happening in a game engine. Sure, like this was the kind of thing that when I first heard about DLSS5, I thought it was more of what it was, which is like actually integrated into the game engine to better understand how light was interacting with the geometry, rather than as post-processing a two-dimensional rendered frame. So I think he gets into a bit of, conflating two things that are completely different. But then he also asks, what do you think is the greatest or most influential game ever made from Nvidia's perspective? And his answer is Doom. Unquestionably, that was the start of 3D. And he doesn't mean like literally the start of 3D. But anyway, you could take a look at the further interview here. Like I said, most of it is not gaming related. But I thought that these takes were definitely worth unpacking around the whole situation and discussion. And like I said, I don't think that we're approaching an end to this discussion. I think that this is all part of the bigger discussion around the appropriate role, if any, of generative AI use in the production of video games, as well as vendor lock and all sorts of things. Anyway, let me know all of your guys' opinions in the comment section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.